right, everyone, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thank you for being here today on this Wednesday afternoon. Every Wednesday at noon is the Lunchtime Discovery Series here inside the SCCU Daily Planet Theater. My name is Chris. I am your host every week for the show, and I'm curator of the Daily Planet Theater. So glad to see you all tuning in online or visiting us here in person inside the globe of the museum for our special lecture. We do this series. We're here every Wednesday at noon with the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's put on by us here in the museum, but it's run by the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. So look at that, government working together to do something great between the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources and the Department of Environmental Quality. This is the coolest thing going on between both I don't know, they didn't say that I could or could not say that, but I think it's pretty cool. We've been running this series here in this space for a while, and it's been a great benefit to us here in the museum, and I hope to the Office of Environmental Education as well. And we get great crowds and great engagement from this series, so I think we've hit on something that's really cool. For the month of March, starting today with this series, since March is Women's History Month, the Office of Environmental Education has put together a great series of programs, so you'll want to check out their website to see all of the upcoming talks for the rest of the month. We have an amazing setup, amazing lineup of speakers. You'll definitely want to tune in online or join us here every Wednesday at noon for that show. Today's guest, kicking off our month-long series of presentations on this topic, is Kelly Owensby. Kelly is the Executive Director of Transplanting Traditions. Please put your hands together and welcome Kelly to the stage.
Hello. Okay. Just making sure this is working. Hello, everyone. This is very exciting. I have shared the work of Transplanting Traditions in many different venues, but nothing like this. So I took a picture, and I'm going to send it to my mom, for sure. So I am the founder and executive director of Transplanting Traditions Community Farm. Has anybody heard of us? Oh, yes. That's amazing. When we first started the organization, I mean, even 5 years ago, no one had really heard about us, so that's really exciting. So what is Transplanting Traditions? We began in 2010, and we're located outside of Chapel Hill. We're a nonprofit teaching farm. We started with a little bit less than 1 acre in 2010-11. And now we're at 8 acres. And this past year, were able to bring in $158,000 worth of income, specifically to the refugee community. So we are unique in a teaching farm. There's all kinds of teaching farms around. There's the Raleigh City Farm. There's a farm called the Breeze Farm. But we specifically work with the refugee population, and specifically from Burma, which I'm going to tell you a lot more about as we go along. But our programs and our nonprofit focus on food access, sustainable agriculture and economic development through sustainable agriculture, and youth and adult education. And then of course, a big part of what we do as well is preserving culture and community. Oops, that's back. Let's go forward. So a little bit about my background. I get a lot of questions about my background because the project it's a very special and unique project. I grew up in Western North Carolina near Asheville, which is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. And I grew up with a family that just is kind of basically plant nerds. My mom loved plants and my dad loved plants. And so I grew up really immersed in sort of the natural world, and grew up really, for some reason, still don't know why, just loving plants and have been a plant nerd forever. And I came down to this area in 2000 to go to college. I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I graduated with a degree in anthropology, and I honestly can't quite remember why, but I immediately knew I wanted to start working on farms and learning about farming and sustainable agriculture. And I think it really kind of marries my love of plants and my love of the environment and my passion for the environment and food and community and culture. So I actually did that for 5 years. I worked on small organic farms all in this area, more in the kind of Chapel Hill, Hillsborough area in Orange County. And I thought I was going to start my own farm. I was kind of on the track to do that, learned an incredible amount from working on farms in this area. And I just hit this wall where I did not want to start my own farm. I wanted to work in the community. I wanted to be able to teach and share. And that's when I started getting involved with a series of community gardens that are all in Carborough and Chapel Hill that provide free space and kind of gardening education for low-income families. And we had a lot of families from Burma start to join those community gardens. And at that time, I honestly barely knew where Burma was. I didn't know anything about the refugee community that was coming to Orange County, but started to learn a lot about that community through the community gardening program. And that's kind of how Transplanting Traditions began in a lot of ways. We had all of these families who were gardening from Burma and found out that most of them farmed in Burma, and they wanted a lot more space than they got in the community gardens, and that they were incredible gardeners. Obviously, they'd farmed for generations. And in 2010, I actually applied for a grant, because we were a nonprofit, through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And we were able to find funding to scale up into a full-sized farm. So that's kind of the basic background, where we started off really small. We're now at a total of 8 acres 11 years later, and are able to bring in our first year when we first started marketing, because we bring in a lot of income to our farmers. That's a lot of the support that we provide. We brought in about $11,000, and now we're bringing in income of close to $180,000 per year. So that's been really exciting. So a little bit about Burma, because this is just, it's really fascinating. Our community of refugees from Burma is pretty large in North Carolina. So refugees from Burma have been one of the largest refugee groups entering the United States. They were the largest refugee group in 2008 or 2007. And then they had been the second largest group for a long time. So you can see some of these numbers, over 152,000 refugees from Burma entering the US. 37% of refugees coming into North Carolina are from Burma. So that's one of our predominant refugee populations. And Chapel Hill and Carborough has one of the largest communities in North Carolina. And we're located in Chapel Hill. So the other thing that's interesting is that the majority of the folks that we work with are an ethnic group called the Ska Karen, which is actually, I think, the 4th most spoken refugee language in the United States. So all this was very interesting and new to me. So there are over 100 ethnic groups in Burma. Some folks say Burma and some folks say Myanmar, and that's actually a kind of a political decision whether you're gonna say Burma or Myanmar. I say Burma because the folks that I work with consider it a little bit of a way of sort of politically resisting the military government that's in charge of Burma. So I follow their lead and say Burma. Burma has had the longest running civil war in history. There's just been systematic human rights violations, especially against a lot of the ethnic groups. And the majority of the country is Buddhist. So that's just a little bit of a background. Agriculture. So the connection between farming and transplanting traditions in Burma has a lot to do with the history of agriculture in Burma. So all the folks that we worked with farmed in Burma, and that's because 65% of the population farms. It's a very rural population. There's not a lot of access to electricity. So that's one of those main reasons, is there's this generational history of farming. Then all the families that we work with came from refugee camps. So I don't know how much folks know about the refugee process, but folks have to flee their homes. They end up usually fleeing on foot because of the Civil War and because of danger to their lives and their families' lives. And they end up in refugee camps along the border. Most of the folks are in refugee camps on the Thai-Burma border. And life in the camps is difficult. Folks remake homes there. They build basically homes out of bamboo. They build these really beautiful homes out of bamboo, but they aren't allowed to leave the camps legally. They are having to rely on rations for food. Many of them do create gardens in the camps for ways to have more access to food. But there is just a lot of, there isn't access to education unless it's internally in the camps. There's over 110,000 refugees in camps along the Thai-Burma border. And I just recently was reading that the average time that a refugee spends in a refugee camp is 17 years. And then the actual resettlement rate is, I think, less than 5%, and is actually, is even going down globally. So a lot of folks live their entire lives there. And when folks are resettled, you don't necessarily get to decide which country you go to. You kind of get to say, my top choice is maybe the US, my second top choice is Australia, but it's really not your choice. So when you get resettled, you don't really know anything necessarily about where you're going and what your life is gonna be like, and transitioning is very, very challenging. Especially for this population. You can imagine, I've tried to put myself in the shoes of a lot of the families that I work with, and thinking about how they lived their lives very much connected to the land, farming, without electricity, without running water, and then they come to the United States, and we live in a very mechanized, very technological-based culture. So you're learning a new language, you've never driven a car. One family told me a story of when they first got to their apartment, they didn't know how to use their stove. They thought you built a fire inside the oven box of the stove, because that's how folks cooked back home, and didn't have there's not a lot of necessarily orientation. And so folks are still really trying to transition, and it's just a really big challenge. There is assistance through the federal government, through what's called the RAP program, but it's short-term assistance that helps folks try to get on their feet, get jobs, and there is access to public benefits, but those only last a short period of time, and then folks are kind of left on their own. And that is, in some ways, where Transplanting Traditions comes in. So we see ourselves as a way to continue supporting families as they attempt to transition to their lives here in the US. So we call ourselves a culturally grounded and community-based project, and that's because we really try to be built from the ground up. We really try to take the input of the folks that we work with to guide the direction of our programming. And we really think about the skills and knowledge that folks bring with them, and how can that be transferred to their lives here, rather than sort of always swimming upstream against major challenges. I mean, most of the folks that I work with just have said, I'm never gonna learn to use a computer. I just never have seen one. I'm 60 years old, just not happening. So we really try and think about what are the skills that folks bring with them, and how can we really build on those skills so that they can find success here in the US. One of those, of course, is farming, and that's why we have such a big focus on farming. All of the families that we work with work off-farm jobs as well. A lot of them work more than full-time on the farm, and they also work, most of them at UNC Chapel Hill, doing night shift work, so 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., doing housekeeping or janitorial work. And a lot of them are very much stuck in these sort of low-wage service jobs without the ability to really go back to school. A lot of the folks we work with are not literate in their own language. The war really disrupted education in the country. So they can feel really, really trapped in their economic situation. And so the opportunity to farm at Transplanting Traditions is a way to really kind of break out of that. So I like to think about Transplanting Traditions as providing support in three ways, and for some reason in my mind, I always think about it as three legs of a stool. So if you can imagine that, the first one is that we provide culturally appropriate economic opportunities through farming. It's kind of a mouthful, but I like to say culturally appropriate because I think it's really important to think about providing economic opportunities that are culturally appropriate. And so that's been a big focus of ours, and we really try and find ways that the farming models that we can use are culturally accessible and culturally appropriate. And I've already talked a little bit about this, but the families that we work with come from generations of farmers. It's just such a strong part of their life. It's part of what they do. It's very much like the culture in agriculture for these families. So it's a way for them to kind of build on their heritage and their history that they brought with them from Burma here in the US. So it's more than just, as you'll hear as I go on, it's more than just a way to make money. So to date, I love this picture, it's so beautiful. To date, we have brought in over $620,000 in income to the farmers that we work with. And that's a big part of what we do as a nonprofit, is supporting our farmers in ways that they can bring in income through farming. And we started, as I said, in 2012 was our first year of growing, and that was like $11,000. And now we're at $180,000 and continuing to be able to grow our income. So the ways that we do that is we help farmers get into farmers markets. It's a marketing through a farmer's market is a really wonderful way because folks are a little more used to that way of marketing, but it's also really challenging because of the language barrier. So we do a lot of ESL-based language courses on how to interact with customers and what customer cultural preferences are here in the US, which are very different from what they are in Burma, so that folks can figure out how to sell things successfully. We've got farmers who go to the Carborough Farmers Market, the Chapel Hill Farmers Market, and it's one of our most successful programs. We also do a big CSA, which is community-supported agriculture. Has anybody heard of that model of the community-supported agriculture? Cool. So it's a really wonderful model. It's like a vegetable subscription box. You sign up online. We've got drop-off sites where people pick up their boxes. You sign up online, and our drop-off sites are in Durham and Chapel Hill, and you get assigned to one of our farmers, and our farmer packs you a box of vegetables every week. You don't get to choose, but it's a mix of everything we've got growing on the farm. So it's a really fun mix of stuff each week. We include recipes, we have people at the drop-off locations, and we unpack your box for you, and if you say, what the heck is this thing and how do I cook it, we give you advice. And it's one of the most incredible models for farmers in general because you kind of know up front at the beginning of the season how much food you need to grow because you know how many people have signed up for your CSA. Versus farmers markets, you might go to the farmers market with the most beautiful harvest of strawberries you've ever had, and it might be the worst rainy tornado thunderstorm day and no one comes to market. So there's a lot more secured sales through a CSA. There's also less customer interaction because folks are basically coming and picking up their boxes, and there might be one person on staff helping customers get their boxes, but it's more comfortable for a lot of our farmers who still feel like they're learning English and feel really kind of uncomfortable interacting with folks outside of their culture. So the second leg of the stool that I think about, again, going back to that stool metaphor where Transplanting Traditions provides these kind of 3 legs of support, is hunger and access to healthy food in the community. So a lot of folks struggle with food insecurity, and a lot of that has to do with income. Not having enough income to basically get enough to eat is a big issue in the refugee community. And so we are able to support that in a lot of different ways. One is that we grow 93,000 pounds of food each year on the farm. I, at one point many years ago, converted that into how many Tyrannosaurus Rexes that equals, and it was like 6 or something. It was just mind-blowing how much food that is. And so a lot of that food gets distributed through our CSA, but a lot of it ends up in the community in a couple of different ways. One is that families share with other families a lot. We started tracking that and found out that on average, the families that we work with, which is on average about 25 families, they share with so many other families in their neighborhood and their community that it ends up being about 600 people every other week that get food from the farm, just from extra and gifting and folks caring for others in their community. Traditional food is a really big focus of what we grow, and this was totally new to me. When I told you about my background and I started farming in this area, I didn't know anything about growing ginger, or in this picture here, we've got water gourd, we've got winged bean, we've got hot chili peppers and wax gourd, all of these Southeast Asian vegetables that farmers grew back home that they really missed. And we've actually, at Transplanting Traditions, started partnering with this organization that is doing research on how to grow what are called tropical perennials, things that you usually find in places, tropical countries like Burma, but that we can grow as annual crops here in North Carolina. So that's been really cool that we've kind of become this focus of this research. The other thing that was really fascinating to me is that folks really started to tell me that having access to traditional food was really important to their food security. And that was hard for me. I tried to wrap my brain around that. We asked a lot of questions, did a lot of interviews, but folks basically reported that without having access to those traditional foods, they didn't feel complete. And I think that because in Burma, food and culture are a lot more connected than I see them being connected here in the US, that not having access to those foods was really challenging for folks on a lot of levels. The other thing is that folks use traditional vegetables as what's called plant medicine or herbal medicine. And that's partly because there isn't as much access to modern medical technology. And it also means that when someone, even after coming here to the US, when someone gets sick with something, they really, really want to have access to that traditional herb or food that they use to heal themselves. So families have told me really cool things like turmeric. It's traditional to take turmeric, which we grow at the farm and just grew apparently everywhere in Burma. And after a baby is born, you put turmeric on the cut umbilical cord because it helps prevent infection and inflammation. Or there's this crop called pennywort that's really important when folks have a lot of digestive issues from parasites. Or one of my favorites is that folks would tell me that bitter melon can be really helpful when someone has a bout of malaria. And I just was recently reading through some sort of research and found that whoever had done this research found that there's actually trace amounts of quinine in bitter melon, which is one of the main ways that we can treat malaria. So there's this really amazing connection between healing and health and traditional foods. So having access to those foods is really important. And we can now consider it part of sort of our definition of food security. It's not just, do you have food? It's what kind of food do you have? Is it culturally appropriate? Is it important to you? So then the other thing that we also, it's a program of ours that helps support hunger and food access is one of my favorite programs. It's called the Share program. And we're able to take donations from community members and through grants. A lot of times it's our CSA members, and also it's funded through grants. And we're able to buy specifically traditional foods, so foods like bitter melon and turmeric and lemongrass. And we're able to donate them to a food pantry that we partner with that works specifically with the refugee community. So it's been really cool for us and for this food pantry, because now the food pantry is able to provide those culturally appropriate foods so that families are getting things they're familiar with, versus families were getting, for example, they were getting powdered milk. And a lot of folks are lactose intolerant and don't drink milk back home, and so that was just perhaps going to waste or being given away. So now they're getting things that they really need and are familiar with and are appropriate to their diets. And then all that food is also bought from our farmers. So it's sort of this really cool program where we're able to both bring in income for our farmers and able to support one of our local food pantries that works with refugee families. So at this point, every month we're able to donate food to 125 refugee families throughout the growing season. So then the third leg of the stool is I like to think about community as one of the most important ways that we support folks. And this one is a little bit more, I wouldn't necessarily say ambiguous, but it's a little harder to quantify than say, we donate food, we grow food, we bring in income. But I have heard from talking to families and doing interviews that having a cultural community space is one of the most important reasons why they come to the farm. And I've told you that our families work off-farm jobs. They're incredibly busy, and yet we still have, on a sunny day, we may have 40 folks there with their kids, picnicking, wandering around the space. And one thing that folks have, explained to me is that through the resettlement process, there's a lot of upheaval. Families have to flee their homes, so they leave behind places that they've been for generations. A lot of times they leave behind family members, especially parents or older family members who don't feel like they can make that transition. They end up in the refugee camps where the average time that someone might live can be 17 years in a refugee camp. So you kind of rebuild some form of community there, and then you get resettled. So it's just this incredible process of constant upheaval. And I think for all of us, we have an innate desire to make community and to make home and to put down roots in all kinds of different ways. But the farm provides a platform or a space for families to be able to do that. So it's one big shared space. Everyone has their own kind of individual plots, but all the plots kind of run into one another. So you can't really tell where one starts or where the other ends. We have one big covered gathering space where we have a greenhouse and we have a place for folks to eat and picnic tables, where folks are washing and packing vegetables. So there's just this ability to have lots of activity around farming, but also just spending time together. That's back again. So what folks say is that they're able to, share their experiences, share new job opportunities, and it's just one of the few places where folks can gather where they feel comfortable outside of church, for example. A lot of folks live in really small, cramped apartments, and they also have come from living basically outside in a lot of ways. They live in these really amazing bamboo homes, but it's very different from sort of living in a small, cramped apartment. And that also brings me to mental health, which is very much connected to that community aspect. When we do our surveys every year, families report, 95% of them, that the farm really helps them to reduce stress and to heal. A lot of families almost everyone comes with some level of trauma. I mean, even just describing that refugee resettlement process, having to flee one's home, that in and of itself is just a baseline of trauma, and then you can add on to it actual atrocities that families have suffered from. So the process of healing and remaking home is really important, and it can be really challenging. The way that we, in our westernized culture, address mental health is very, very different than the way that families want to address mental health, families from Burma. It's not necessarily, seeing a psychologist or a therapist or taking a pill. It's very, very different. And so we have found that the farm provides a really incredible way for families to be outside in nature. That's one thing that they really say that they miss. To do something that they love and that is rewarding and is meaningful and that they're good at, especially when, for the most part, when they are resettled here and they're trying to go about their daily life, there's a lot of things that they're not good at. They're struggling with English. People don't understand them. They're struggling at their job, perhaps. Some folks never want to learn to drive a car, and those that do are terrified. So you can imagine kind of constantly struggling in your day-to-day, the kind of toll that can take. But having a space that you can come to where you're doing something that's really familiar, farming, that you love, with people that are in your community and culture that speak your language. You're providing food for yourself and your family. You're bringing in some income to yourself and your family. So these are some of the reasons why we consider the project affecting the mental health and the healing of a lot of the families that we work with. So those are the three legs of the stool. Our programs are adult education, our Share, which I talked about, the food access program, cross-cultural engagement through tours and public speaking and things of that nature, and then youth leadership. So adult education. A lot of folks ask me, why do you all do so much adult education around farming? If everyone farmed in Burma, why is that really necessary? And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, Burma is a tropical country. It's very, very different from here. A lot of folks never had seen a winter. One family told me that when they first landed in RDU, it was the winter, and they thought all of our trees were dead. They're like, why does nothing have leaves on it? What is wrong with this place? So farming in the winter is very different than farming in the summer. And it's not just seasons, it's the way that we market. One woman told me once that she lived she lived in a very rural area, and she would basically take all of her harvest and put it into a boat. There's a lot of waterways and a lot of water in Burma. And she would travel in basically like a large canoe to a place where she could market her product. So that's really different. We obviously don't throw everything in a canoe and take like a 2-day boat ride in order to sell our vegetables. I could go on and on. There's a lot of reasons why things are really different. So we provide an incredible amount of adult education. This is a picture from what's happening right now is called our Grower School. And we do about 14 courses throughout the winter. We sit down and we do crop planning. We do financial literacy. We talk about how do you file your farm taxes? How do you analyze your business? How can you improve your profit? And we do all this in 3 languages. So that's also really, we work with many different ethnic groups that speak different languages. There's 3 main languages that we work with. This is just an example of some of the materials that we've created for families. I think I mentioned before that a lot of our families are not literate in their own written language. And so some folks are, some folks aren't. It's much more of an oral history-based culture, and especially some of the rural areas. Some folks can write really basic, but maybe not on an advanced level. So we have learned to create materials that are very picture-based. This is one of our crop planning guides that families can fill out, and they follow these all year so that they have a way to know when to plant things, how much to plant it. This one that's blue, more blue and green, is about, I think it's like 16 pages long, because it's for the whole spring and summer and fall of everything they're gonna plant and the amounts. It's one of my favorite. It's something I worked on a lot, developing these tools, and it's just a really fun, creative challenge to say, how can I take all the agricultural knowledge that I have and translate it so that it is usable to someone who maybe doesn't read? And so it's been really fun to do that. Here's another example. This is a chart that kind of gives people a guide on what they do when they wash and pack their vegetables. Because every single vegetable can have a different protocol for, do you wash it and then put it in the cooler? Or do you leave it in the cool water for a long time? Or does it not need to get washed? And all these things are really important. Farming is, you have to know so many things to be able to farm successfully. If you all know any farmers in your life, I think they're some of the brightest people that we have. So here's just another example of a way that we broke down that information so that our farmers have a guide that they can follow so that they can do a really good job at their what's called post-harvest handling. So then we also do a ton of hands-on workshops, and we do these on the farm. And this is one where we're in a hoop house and we're trellising peas, or we teach people how to use drip irrigation or fertilizer usage, or the list just goes on for the on-farm workshops. And those are some of the best workshops that we do because folks learn really well hands-on. We also do a lot of field trips. We go to tons of local farms in this area. And then I talked a little bit already about our Share program, which is our food access program. And then we do a lot of community engagement through farm tours. We gave, I think, 19 tours to about 400 people last year. So those are all tours that we do charge for, but all the money goes back to support the nonprofit itself. And we really love to share. We find being able to give tours is a really great way to teach the public about sustainable agriculture and the environment, and to teach them about the community of refugees from Burma that are in Chapel Hill and Scarborough that a lot of people aren't aware of, that can, even be folks' neighbors. And then one of my favorite programs is our refugee teen program. So we work with young refugee women. We started off working with both young men and women in a co-ed group, but we now only work with young refugee women. And we basically do a couple of different things through that program. It's really first and foremost a leadership development program that has been created by the youth themselves. It's very youth driven. So we want it to be really relevant. I don't want to come into the program and say, this is what I think you all need to do whatever. So what it has kind of boiled down to is being about leadership development, developing critical thinking and communication skills. Public speaking is a really big part of the development that we provide. We also provide a space for youth to engage culturally with their own culture, with the elders in their community who are often at the farm. And that's because a lot of youth have told me that it's very challenging growing up in the US with back home, they've got one foot in the door very, very much in their culture. With their families are still very much continuing specific cultural practices of eating and the way that you talk to elders, or what young women are not allowed to do versus young men. And then when they're out in high school, they're kind of having to wear their hat of being more American. And so there's a lot of struggle with identity in terms of, how am I growing up as a young Asian American that came here as a refugee? So we do a lot of cultural engagement. And then we also focus a lot on food justice. So the youth see themselves as advocates for the farmers themselves. A lot of the farmers are their parents or their aunts or their grandparents even. And the farmers that we work with don't feel very comfortable speaking in public or even talking to others. If we have folks come on a tour, they prefer to kind of continue to work in their rows and hide away a little bit. And so it can be hard for them to tell their story of who they are, what they need. And so the youth see themselves as being able to do that for the farmers themselves and to just tell the story of who they are. Who are the Karen people from Burma? Who are the Chin people from Burma? Why are they here? What do they need in our community? What are their practices? Things like that. I love this picture. This is our youth program assistant with her mother. We also have made sure that our program is providing professional development for young women. So Talar, last year, she got hired as our youth program assistant. So she's part of our part-time staff. She's now a senior in high school, but she is an incredibly integral part of our organization's part-time staff. And she, along with me and another staff person, run the youth program. And she had been a part of the youth program for a couple years and showed an incredible amount of dedication and love of the program. And so each year we get to hire one of our youth that really demonstrate that sort of excellence. The rest of our youth also get paid a stipend. They have to complete a certain amount of hours, so it's sort of like an internship. But everything that they do is very mutually beneficial. So they do a lot of work for the organization, but we also send them to conferences. We provide trainings, whether it's public speaking or college readiness, things like that. I talked a little bit about cultural engagement. Almost every year we do some sort of big project that is a way of kind of documenting the culture of the farmers or of folks' parents. And it's a way for the youth to really start to kind of deep dive into their culture in ways that they might not otherwise. And it creates this incredible sense of pride, which I really love to see. And then public speaking, we do, as I said, a lot of tours, and whenever we can, we have the youth come along on our tours. And they come along with me, and when we're giving a paid tour to folks, I make sure that the youth are giving a lot of that tour, and we work with them to learn how to speak about themselves and how to tell their story. We also do quite a lot of speaking engagements, and whenever I can, I bring youth along with me, and I have them give part of a presentation. And we actually just this winter had Talar, who I showed you that picture of, was able to give a paid presentation completely by herself, which was very exciting. And then we also have youth, basically they go to the farmers market with our farmers who sell there, and they take one of the Southeast Asian traditional vegetables that our farmers are selling that can sometimes be a little bit hard to market to our customer base who's not familiar with bitter melon or pennywort or lemongrass, and they do a really cool cooking demonstration and give out samples. So that's a really great way for them to connect with their cultural food traditions and to speak with customers. And we do a teen cooking program for a week each year as well, which helps them to learn how to basically be able to do those cooking demonstrations. Last year, this is a flyer from the culmination of our oral history project that the youth did over the summer of 2019. They basically collected stories around food and farming and also just the refugee experience from their parents and aunts and grandparents. And we kind of strung it all together into basically a podcast. Or has anybody ever been to the Audio Under the Stars that the Center for Documentary Studies puts on? It's similar to that, and we basically invited the public to come, and everybody just brought a picnic blanket, we had food, and everyone just sat down and closed their eyes and listened to this whole 45-minute series of stories that the youth had collected, sort of like a podcast. So every year there's some sort of oral history project that we do. And I think that's it. That's the end. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing with us. We have a few minutes for questions remaining, so if you have something you're curious about, wave at me. If you're here on the first floor, I'll bring you a microphone. If you're up on the balconies, just wave down at me. We'll call on you, and you yell down, and then we'll use the microphones to repeat the questions and make sure that everyone can hear. But I saw a hand back here first, so we'll get started.
Oh my. Why do you no longer work with with boys and just work with young women?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's probably a complicated answer. We basically did not have boys showing up as much as the young women. And our young women have showed an incredible amount of dedication to the program, and the young boys were not completing the hours that were required to participate in the program. We know that there is a really big need for programming for young boys in the community. We see there being a lot of dropout rates and challenges that young boys face even more than young women in the refugee community. And I have a lot of thoughts that are all just observational about why that is. But I don't think that we are quite the project to provide that programming, mostly because our staff is all women. And I think that if we had a role model that was a male and had a kind of a second program that we could provide, I think it would be more successful. But we are very much a women-run organization. 93% of our businesses on the farm are run by women, which I have found to be fascinating because Burma is very much a culture that is very patriarchally based. Women don't have a lot of power in their communities. However, I see them at the farm gaining a lot of economic power through being business owners. And that's been really interesting to see. But yeah.
Others, wave at me. Kelly, what's been the most interesting thing you think you've learned from working alongside these folks?
Oh, that's a great question. There's probably so many answers. I love the farm in so many ways. I would say that one thing that has been really beautiful to see is the resiliency that I see with the farmers at Transplanting Traditions. You know, everyone has their own individual businesses, and we have 12 small businesses that run off of our 8 acres out there. And they range in different sizes, from pretty big to like very small and someone who's just starting. But there is this incredible support that everyone provides for one another. And that has just been a really interesting and beautiful thing for me to see. I think one example is, I think it was 2018 when we had such devastation from the hurricane. We had major flooding. We lost almost all of our fall crops. We had already sold our CSA shares, which people pay up front for their CSA shares. And the idea of a CSA model is that if a customer is paying into, they're paying you ahead of time because they're saying, hey, if a hurricane happens, that's not your fault. You can't do anything about that. I want to be someone who is supporting the food system, whether or not there's a hurricane. And so you might not, you don't get your vegetables if something like that happens. But our farmers didn't feel good about that. They bought in a lot of vegetables. And it was just I felt devastated. And I showed up for work that day, and everybody was just helping each other, singing. Someone had a bunch of broccoli that was okay. Someone else's had completely flooded, so they were distributing it amongst themselves equally. And I think I definitely am looking for models of resiliency, especially with climate chaos happening. And I think that models like that, where there is a community support and a very integrated community support that provides that resiliency, it meant that those farmers got through that way better than what I saw a lot of other farmers being able to, who are operating much more independently. And so I think one of my favorite things that I have really started to think more about and observe from watching the community at Transplanting Traditions is that support and that really deep-rooted community that I've never really quite experienced myself.
Thanks. You mentioned briefly that there are cultural differences in customer expectations in a market context. Can you give any examples of that? That was very intriguing to me.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that comes from, let's see, how do I put this? One thing that folks always tease me about is that they say as Americans we like our food to be very pretty. And that is true. We like our food to be really pretty. We take pictures of it. We arrange it. We sprinkle things on top of it. And I think food is a little bit more practical. And folks, maybe eat something that is a little bit larger. Than we want things to be really small cucumbers versus big seedy cucumbers. There's also just very different ways of cooking things. And I think a lot of it is just around sizes of vegetables. And when we do a lot of cooking events where we actually hire one of our farmers, a lot of our farmers are incredible cooks, to design a menu, and then we sit down and do sort of it's usually a 4 or 5 course fancy meal. And the first couple times we had to run through it, we had to really shift things a lot. We don't like to leave a lot of large bones in our food, but folks don't care about that. Folks eat with their hands traditionally. So there's just a very different connection to food that is less, can't quite think of the word. I want to say not observational, but it's just a lot of little things like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting.
All right, any others? Wave at me. If not, let's give Kelly one more round of applause to say thank you.
Thank you all.
And we'll be back here next Wednesday at noon. Next week, we'll have Dr. Bronwyn Williams. She is the research curator for non-molluscan invertebrates here at the museum. What that means is that she's out in creeks, rivers, and streams discovering crayfish species and leeches. And I think her talk next week is about leeches in addition to other aspects of her research. Bronwyn is amazing. She's part of the team here at the museum. So come back and see us again for that one. It'll be great. And we'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.